So I've chosen a reading from John chapter 21 this morning. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat. But that night, they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net to the right side of the boat and you'll find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he had raised from the dead. Words inspired by God. Edwin Abbott was an English writer who in 1884 penned a wonderful little novella called Flatland. And the story involves beings from a third dimension encountering beings in a second dimension. So let me just try to explain it very, very briefly. A second dimension is something that exists on a plane, like a sheet of paper. If you take a sheet of paper, there are only two dimensions. So anything on it is going to look like a square or a circle or a triangle or a trapezoid or a parallelogram or a rectangle or an ellipse. They're all just two-dimensional figures. So they have length and breadth, but they have no height whatsoever. And in this novella, a being from a third dimension arrives and tries to interact with the second dimensional creatures. And in this instance, it's a sphere, like a ball, trying to encounter two-dimensional beings. And of course, the two-dimensional beings, they can't grok it. They cannot see into a third dimension. There's no sense of height, so they can't interact with it. But somehow, this third dimensional being, this ball, manages to show one of the beings on Flatland that there is actually a third dimension. And he takes one of these squares, elevates it, and shows it what the third dimension is like. And this square is absolutely thrilled with the notion of a third dimension. You can see now, pyramids, and cubes, and spheres, these kinds, and he's absolutely elated. And so he comes back down to Flatland, and he tells everybody in Flatland about his experience. And they think he's crazy. Doesn't make any sense to him. So they actually lock him up. They put him in prison. Now, what would a prison look like in Flatland? It would like, for instance, like a square drawn on a piece of paper. And they put him inside. There's a little door on the side. They open the door. They stick him in. And there's a whole bunch of other crazy people inside there with him. And then there are prison guards outside. And he's inside in the prison, this two-dimensional square. So what does he do? He elevates himself into the third dimension. And as far as the beings inside in the prison are concerned, he just disappeared. Because they can't see into the third dimension, all that happens was he was here 1 second and now he's gone. Now imagine he decided to start playing tricks on them. Imagine instead of just elevating straight up and disappearing, imagine he started walking towards the wall of the prison from the inside and then elevated and then went laterally for a moment and then came back down again and kept walking. As far as the people inside and outside was concerned, he simply walked up to the wall, walked through it, and now is walking on the outside. So that's what it looks like, if you live in flatland. If you live in a two-dimensional world and you're hearing about beings who exist in a three-dimensional reality, you don't have any words to explain it or to understand it. You're going to think that they're crazy. So I want to play around with that today. For the last 2 Sundays, I've been talking about resurrection. So this is the third Sunday. I'm going to do a quick recap of the first 2 and then open up to Q&A afterwards. So firstly, I want to try and extrapolate from this notion of flat land. So in actual fact, this novella could actually give you an idea what resurrection would look like. Jesus is appearing and disappearing. He ascends at some stage. After 40 days, he ascends into the heavens. So what if Jesus, is inhabiting a higher dimensional reality, and he's simply going to that higher dimensional reality, one that allows him to apparently appear and disappear, manifest and demanifest, walk through walls or whatever? What if, resurrection itself is actually a higher dimensional event that's happening in a three-dimensional world, but we have no experiences for it in this two-dimensional world of ours to explain what it is? Now, we happen to live in a three-dimensional world. So what if resurrection is in a fourth or a fifth or a sixth or a seventh dimension? And therefore, resurrection to us appears totally miraculous. But it's just that Jesus, as an ascended master, is operating from a totally different dimension and occasionally comes down and is seen here. But we don't have the language to articulate it. And so, for instance, people who experience near-death experiences or people who have mystical experiences, they'll constantly tell us that this was an ineffable experience. Ineffability literally means it is inarticulatable. We do not have the language to express the experiences we just had. And people who live in the lower dimensions, they haven't had those kinds of experiences, and so they can't understand what these other beings are telling them. Now, we're lucky enough that modern science is beginning to give us some kind of language to play with this. So I mentioned last week about the notion of a quantum leap. In quantum mechanics, we know that if an electron appears in place A and subsequently in place A, it does not have to occupy all of the spaces in between A and B in order to move from A to B. It does not move from A to B. It manifests at A, disappears momentarily, and then remanifests at B. It is not traveling in between. There's also a notion in quantum mechanics called quantum tunneling, where it appears that electrons are moving through impenetrable barriers, but they're not moving through any barrier. In fact, they're not moving at all. They're manifesting, demanifesting, and remanifesting. So is that what we're talking about when we're talking about, Jesus' resurrection? So that's just to extrapolate from that image of flatland. I talked a few weeks ago then about how did the apostles who encountered Jesus after his resurrection, how did they deal with the objections they encountered from people? People who said, for instance, it was a ghost. That's all you saw was a ghost. They said, no, it wasn't a ghost. He ate fish with us. He said to Thomas, put your finger into the nail marks. Put your fist into my side where the spear went. So it wasn't a ghost. Ghosts don't eat fish. Ghosts, don't bleed. You can't put your hand around a ghost's hand. So the other objection was then, well, if it was just the same Jesus, maybe he was just resuscitated. And as I said, there's a huge difference between resuscitation and resurrection. Lazarus was resuscitated. The widow's son of Nain was resuscitated. Jairus' daughter was resuscitated, but they had to die again. This was not resuscitation. So how did they deal with that objection? What they said was, he had totally different kinds of abilities. It really was he ate fish, we touched him, we talked with him, but there was something radically different about him. He seemed to be able to pass through doors, to appear and to disappear. He was able to disguise his appearance. And as I was reading John chapter 21 just this morning, just a few moments ago, it suddenly struck me as really strange that at the very end of that story, we're told the disciples didn't say to him, "Who are you?" because they knew who he was. Why did John put that piece in there? Because there's something radically different. They're not quite sure who he is. So he's disguised his appearance in some way. So at some level, they know who he is, but at another level, they don't recognize who he is. So there's this movement between being three-dimensional beings as they are and being elevated into a fifth or a sixth or a seventh dimension in order to know whom they're encountering. So these were the objections they had to deal with. Number 3, I talked about what actually arose from the dead, because the issue is not about bodily resurrection. The issue is about the nature of the body that resurrected. And I suggested that part of the problem is that the kind of the paucity of terminology in the English language to deal with this kind of esoterica is astounding. Other languages are much better equipped to deal with esoteric concepts. So for instance, in Egypt, you have two words for body. You had ka and ba, one representing the physicality of us and the other representing the etheric or the kind of energy template of which the physical body is simply a printout. Persians had the same notion. They had a notion called fravashi, and fravashi was the energy template of which the physical body was just hard copy. The Indian model is the most sophisticated, I believe, and it has 7 different levels of body. The gross physical body, made up of our molecular, substances. Then there's the etheric body, the energy. Then there's the astral body, the body that we inhabit when we're dreaming at night and where our emotions come from, the place that becomes the repository of all of the experiences of the incarnation just ended. Then there's the mental body, the place of ratiocination, the place of Plato's ideal realm. Then there's the 5th body, the causal body, which is the psychic body, where we discover all our psychic abilities, telepathy, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, psychokinesis, telekinesis, these kinds of things. And it is the repository of all of the experiences of all of the incarnations we've ever had, according to Hinduism. Then there's a 6th level body called Atman, which is the soul self. And then finally, there's Brahman. So there are 7 different bodies when you talk about Hinduism. But the New Testament is written in Greek. In Greek, Paul is telling us that, you have to be really, really careful which word you're using, because there are 3 words in Greek for body. There are sarx, soma, and pneuma. Sarx means this flesh and blood stuff. Soma is the etheric energy template, and pneuma is the spirit body. And Paul says very, very definitely, when he's speaking about resurrection, he says sarx cannot inhabit the kingdom of God. Flesh and blood cannot inhabit the kingdom of God. So resurrection is not about the revivification of sarx. It's about movement into soma or pneuma. And so when Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, in chapter 11, he's dealing with Eucharist, and in chapter 15, he's dealing with resurrection, he's using very specific terminology. So he's telling us that when we, for instance, consume the species in Eucharist, we're not biting into Jesus' big toe or into his kidney. We're not talking about sarx. We're talking about pneuma, the spirit body of Jesus. And the same thing then is true of resurrection. We have to really understand that, there's a movement between the different levels of body that Jesus is doing as an ascended master. The 4th point I talked about was the notion of the verb, which is translated into English as to appear. The Greek verb which is used in the New Testament, and indeed in the Greek translations of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, the Greek verb to appear means really to make himself visible to. So it feels like it's being generated from the other side. So for instance, a famous Hebrew philosopher in Egypt and Alexandria, he was called Philo of Alexandria, writing about the time of Christ. He says, Abraham did not see God, but God made himself visible to Abraham. So it was God who was taking the initiative. And you get the impression in the New Testament, it is Jesus who's taking the initiative in these post-resurrection appearances. Now, this same Greek verb is used in all of the theophanies of God in the Hebrew scriptures when they're translated. It is God who's taking the initiative. In the story of the transfiguration in the synoptic gospels, it is Moses and Elijah who are taking the initiative in making themselves visible to Jesus and the disciples. And in Luke's gospel, when the shepherds have an experience of the angels in heaven, it is the angels who are taking the initiative to appear. And when an angel comforts Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, it is the angel who's taking the initiative there. So I was at pains to explain what does it actually mean then when there's a visual kind of a perception on the part of the apostles. And I created a few analogies to suggest that there's actually has to be movement from both sides. And I gave the analogy, if I got an invitation from a friend of mine who's visiting from out of state, and he's going to be in Palo Alto tomorrow, and he's staying in a hotel, and he's on the 5th floor, and he invites me to come down and have a meal with him in the restaurant, which is in the lobby. And I drive down to Palo Alto, and I have to park underground, 3 levels underground in parking. Now, in order for the encounter to happen in the restaurant, he has to come down 4 stages from 5 to 1, and I got to go up 3 from 3 under to the lobby in order for us to have a face-to-face encounter. And it's interesting, we're meeting in a restaurant. And it was in the Eucharistic encounters that the apostles recognized Jesus again and again and again. This morning's story at the lake was a Eucharistic encounter with bread and fish. And so 2 people are involved here. God is choosing to make himself visible, but there has to be some movement on our part. We have to transcend from a flatland mentality to a 3 or a 4th or a 5th dimensional in order to make the appearance possible. So we have to shift our modalities. And I suggested to you that the apostles had to shift their modalities, and Jesus had to shift his being in order to have a post-resurrection appearance be possible. And we do this very same thing again. We kind of unconsciously shift modalities. If I suggested, if you had no knowledge of flora, you could never infer a golden daffodil from an ugly bulb if you didn't know something about flora. Or you could never infer an elegant, majestic oak tree from a simple acorn. Or if you didn't know how to read a book and you were presented with a book, all you would see was a white sheet of paper with black splotches of ink in it. So you have to extrapolate. You have to rise to a wholly different level in order to make sense and to see the story hidden in the black splotches. And it's the same thing. Without the mystical sense, we can't infer spirit from mere matter, nor can we infer the existence of the soul from the experience of the ego. And so as we're wrestling with incarnation, it's an invitation again and again and again to stop living in a flatland reality and to elevate our consciousness to different levels. That's what mysticism is. That's what Eucharist is about. Unless we can, access those levels, Eucharist is merely a kind of the remembering a meal that happened 2,000 years ago, and you're using ordinary bread and ordinary wine to remember something that happened, but that has no effect on you, unless you can transcend and move into that mystical space. Then I started at the beginning of last Sunday, I started playing around with the notion of resurrection, to try to, and this wasn't out of any sense of disrespect. I was trying to unhook our understanding of resurrection from the mere physical. Now, the physical did happen, but it's not just merely physical. So I started playing around with how come they couldn't recognize him? How many other dudes are walking around Jerusalem with holes in their hands and their feet? Why didn't they recognize him? Where was he during the 40 days? He made 14 appearances, lasting a total of maybe 24 hours. Where was he for the rest of the time? Did he go back into the tomb and hide out there? Did he go into the desert and do another kind of a retreat? Or did he kind of hang out in his mother's house and tell her, please don't tell anybody I'm at home? And what happened during the ascension when this physical body ascended? Is he moving merely from flatland to 3-dimensional, or is he elevating into space because he's going to run out of oxygen within 5 miles? And how come they didn't recognize his voice? He's Galilean, for God's sake. How come they didn't recognize it? And where did he get his clothes? The soldiers stole his clothes at the crucifixion. And when they went to the tomb on Sunday morning, the shroud in which he was wrapped was still in the tomb. So is he walking naked around Jerusalem? Or did the angels kind of visit Nordstrom's and buy him an outfit? Or did they kind of go into a house, the backyard of a house, and take some garments off the clothesline? So I'm doing this just merely to try to unhook us from the fear, from just thinking about physicality when we think about resurrection. So that was another point I made. I then talked about the notion of fractals. So I'm trying to get at this resurrection phenomenon, which is very, very real to me, from many, many different facets, scientific and historic and literary and whatever. So in actual fact, a fractal, as we know, is just a pattern which is repeated at an infinite number of scales. It's the same pattern, but it's repeated at an infinite number of scales. And you can actually generate very beautifully visual ones from simple mathematical formulations. Now, resurrection is happening all the time at a fractal level. So when you look at your own physical body, there's not a single cell in your body now that was there 7 years ago. Every single cell in your body has been replaced in a 7-year cycle. In fact, your entire skeletal system is replaced on a 6-monthly cycle. Your stomach lining is replaced on a 6-week cycle. Your skin, all of the skin in your body is replaced on a 4-week cycle. And you recreate yourself every time you breathe, which is about 18 times a minute. In fact, you recreate yourself every time your heart beats, which is about 70 times a minute. So there's fractals within fractals within fractals in which you're experiencing resurrection, even in your physicality. Your entire life is a fractal of God's life. You know, I love to say that, you know, life as you experience it is actually an experience that the ego is having. And the ego is an experience that the soul is having. And your soul is an experience that your spirit is having. And your spirit is an experience that God is having. So your dreams within dreams within dreams. So there's fractals all the way. Your entire lifetime is a fractal of divinity, which is a way, way above all of our dimensional analysis. In fact, your soul itself has a fractal nature because there's a pre-incarnational phase to your soul. There's an incarnational phase to your soul. There's a post-incarnational phase to your soul. And there's a reincarnational phase to your soul. So the soul itself actually is a fractal hologram of God. I talked about the notion of the two crosses. There's the cross of crucifixion, you know, where for me, the vertical arm of the cross and the cross itself is not merely a symbol of an instrument of torture on which Jesus died. It is not just that. The vertical arm for me represents the connection between the transcendence of God and her immanence, between the divine and the secular. And the horizontal arm of the cross represents the brotherhood, sisterhood of all living beings. And the intersection point of the two is your soul self, your mission self, your purpose self. So, you know, crucifixion itself is actually a cross representing transcendence, immanence, and the brotherhood, sisterhood of all beings. And there's a cross of resurrection. The before-after images of the apostles trying to explain that Jesus was he was the same person before and after. He ate fish. So the horizontal arm of this cross is the before-after images. And the below-above images represent the fact that he's radically transformed. Although it is he's radically different in some way. So those were the two notions of the cross of crucifixion and the cross of resurrection. I talked then about the encounter at Lake Tiberias, which was the one that I read for us this morning. And in this one, we're experiencing another Eucharistic encounter. I said to you many, many times that you know you're in the presence of a Eucharist when you get the phrases, he took, he broke, he took, he broke, he blessed, and he distributed. When you see those four phrases, you know you're in the presence of a Eucharistic encounter. And that's precisely what happens. So Jesus on the shore, he's got some fish there, he's got some bread there. The disciples have been fishing all night, they caught nothing, and then they listen to him and they bring this huge haul of fish. And I unpacked two elements of that for you. Why was it, if Jesus was preparing breakfast for them, why didn't he have enough fish for the entire group? He could have just as easily manifested enough fish for 8 of them as he could for, just himself. So why did he say to Peter, go into the boat and bring some of the stuff you just caught? Because it's symbolic. It's a kind of mystical symbolism where he's saying, from now on, you have to learn how to feed yourselves and feed my people. So I've been feeding you now. And it's not just the bread and the fish I'm giving you for breakfast. It is the teachings. It's what I've demonstrated to you by my lifestyle and by my words. I fed you for 3 years. Now you must begin to feed other people. You are fishers of men and feeders of men. You are fishers of, fishers and feeders of all human beings. And the food has to be the good news that you're preaching and the demonstration of lives lived totally in alignment with God. So that was the reason why Christ didn't have enough fish for the group, because now he wanted them to become independent and become feeders and fishers of everybody else. And I looked at this number. Why were there 153 fish? Because in Greek taxonomy, the Greeks believed there were only 153 different species of fish in our rivers and in our oceans. And so the fact that there was 153 fish, but the net did not break, demonstrates to me that the net is the kingdom of God. There is enough room in the kingdom of God for all of us. It's not just for baptized Catholics who die without mortal sin on their souls. The kingdom of heaven is a banquet which is set with such largesse that there is nobody who is excluded from it. And Christ is trying to teach them that. And so it became really, really upsetting to me that as a Catholic priest, I was told that I couldn't allow non-Catholics to receive communion, or the divorced and remarried, to receive communion, or gay people to receive communion. That didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. And we never did it at COJ. Everybody was welcome to the banquet. So that was the encounter at the lake. And then finally, I talked about the deeper mystical truth of resurrection. If you remember, I began last Sunday by reading a story which I had written in Easter of 1980, 41 years ago, about an encounter between Jesus and Magdalene. You know, and I went on to say then that this beautiful love story between Jesus and the Magdalene is not just a love affair between a man and a woman. It is not just a love affair between soulmates, but actually it is a love affair between the feminine and the masculine aspects of God itself, between the transcendence and the immanence of God. It's a love affair, you know, within the divinity itself. And it's a love affair also between the twin facets of your soul, between the Atman and the Jiva, between the aspect of your soul which never leaves the sight of God, so it's transcendent, and the aspect of your soul which incarnates again and again and again as Jiva. It's this kind of a love affair. And I will really believe that all love stories, I don't care whether they're poetry or stories or music, I don't care who's singing them. Anytime you read or sing a love story, you're simply having a nostalgic, dimly remembered images of your own true nature, of your own true origin, and of your own final homecoming. So let's open it up to Q&A, guys.
I wanted to just see if you want to comment on the fact that sometimes you can dream about someone who's passed on, but then sometimes it's like they actually are there. I had an experience when my older sister passed that there was a big trellis and a gate, and we met there. That was very different. And then also that when my mother and my aunt and Kathleen Lyons passed away, a certain person who'd passed on just came to me as like to tell me that they were passing. So then that person was not living. So do you want to comment on any of that?
Yes,
that you know, yeah, there are other resurrections maybe.
Yeah, very, very beautiful. So in the Hindu model of body, as I said to you, the third level of body is called the astral body. And according to Hinduism, that is the body that we use when we're actually dreaming. So when you're dreaming at night, you've left your physicality pretty much. There's just enough energy left in it to keep the kind of the vital systems, you know, heart beating, breathing, etc. But your consciousness is not really with your physical body anymore. It's gone into the astral realm. And the astral realm is the place in which dreams manifest and you have your emotional experiences. Now, it is also the lobby in the story I told you about meeting a friend of mine in Palo Alto for lunch. I'm 3 levels down in the parking lot and he's 5 levels up, you know, in the hotel. He has to come down 4 levels to get to the lobby and I've got to go up 3 levels to go to the lobby. Now, when we're dreaming, we're already 3 levels up. So it is much easier for those who've departed to make the journey from the 5th floor to the 1st floor than to have to come all the way down to the underground garage where we spend the rest of our lives. And so in the dream state, it is much easier for us to have encounters with those who have passed. Now we have to differentiate between kind of ordinary dreams, because we have dreams in the astral body which have nothing got to do with those who have departed. But when the departed choose to use our dream state in order to have encounters with us, there's a totally different quality to the dream, completely different. You know when you wake up that this was a very special kind of dream. It's the kind of dream you're never going to forget. The rest of the dreams are going to be gone within 2 or 3 minutes of waking. Once you get bombarded with sensory input, you open your eyes when you wake up in the morning, the dream is gone completely. These dreams do not vanish because they're not dreams per se. They're encounters in which beings who exist at the 7th level can get down to the kind of the lobby, and you get up from kind of the basement, 3 levels under, and you encounter with them. So again and again and again, and some people have this gift. I mean, psychics and mediums obviously have the ability of kind of traversing that terrain more easily than the rest of us. And so there's a big difference in our dream life between dreams which are real encounters with the departed and dreams which are merely the workings of the kind of the astral body, you know, dealing with the events of the day.
I was thinking about these 7 levels of body. And Seán, you know, you and I have had this conversation around, I have this interest in working with Rudolf Steiner's ideas. And he has this book on how to know higher worlds. And there are practices in there. And I was thinking that being able to access these 7 levels of body might be helpful in fulfilling my mission. And so I was wondering if you have any insights about working with these different levels of body, and also what our intention should be as we work with these levels of body.
Okay, great. It's a great question, Michael. So like all great spiritual practices, there's a caveat. You know, I've said to you many times that I believe the first sin was the breach of a taboo. And that taboo had to do with the fact that if people have, you know, mystical experiences for which they're not prepared, one or two things are going to happen. Either they're going to go crazy because they can't now come back to the real world, you know, and be in it meaningfully. It doesn't make sense to them. Or else they're going to become, you know, inflated and become narcissists. So it becomes really, really important that there is some kind of initiation process, or there are some kinds of mentor figures who've been there, you know, who can show us the ropes and allow us to avoid the pitfalls. Because when you begin traveling in these realms, you're also going through very, very dangerous levels. For instance, in the Hindu model, there are 2 levels to the astral plane. There's the lower astral and the higher astral plane. The higher astral are the place where the angelic beings and ascended masters, you know, can hang out. The lower astral planes are places where discombobulated, recently departed are stuck because they're not moving towards the light. And so they're addicted to life on planet Earth. They don't have physical bodies in order to act out their needs or particularly their addictions anymore. And so they hang around looking for kind of vessels to inhabit or possess in order that they may indulge, you know, their addiction to Earth's life. Now, when you're traveling at night in your dream then, and when you're consciously trying to move into these realms, you have to go with protection. So there was this great, you know, prayer that we were taught as little kids in Ireland. I don't know if you were taught it here. You started the day and you ended the day with a prayer that said, "Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, ever this night be at my side, to light and guard, to rule and guide. Amen." So you're going off into the night travels protected by angelic beings. And in the morning, you do the same prayer. "Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, ever this day be at my side, to light and guard, to rule and guide. Amen." So you want angelic protection for your waking life and for your sleeping life, because you're navigating a minefield, literally, which is inhabited by, you know, discombobulated entities of various kinds. So you need to go with protection. That's the first thing, the caveat. The second thing is then that it is very important that you have some kind of mentor figure or some kind of a community that's allowing you to navigate these realms, because they are dangerous for the 2 reasons: for inflation, you know, or for the inability to operate in the waking consciousness again. Having said that, then there are lots of different practices that allow you to kind of travel in those realms. Obviously stuff like meditation techniques, because although there are hundreds of different schools of meditation, the objective of all meditation, I don't care whether it's Buddhist or Jewish or Hindu or Christian, the objective of all meditation is the disidentification with the ego and the re-identification with higher and higher levels of the self. That's the objective of all meditation. So meditation allows you to do it. Time spent in nature allows you to do it. Hanging around little children and watching them at play does it. Imagination, and I've been at pains many, many times to differentiate between imagination and kind of fantasy. Fantasy is the faculty that allows us to make up stuff that's not real. That's not meditation. That's not imagination. Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift my state of consciousness, enter into realms, and have encounters with energies and entities at those other levels, dialogue with them, learn from them, and then bring that back down into waking consciousness. So imagination is a very, very powerful tool. And so whether your imagination gets its articulation through artwork, if you're a painter, or you're a dancer, or you write poetry, or you read poetry. So all of the art forms, so dancing, music, chanting, pain can do it. It was my experience in Kenya that I got malaria at least once every year for 14 years that I was there. The only upside to malaria, I'd have these really fevers, was that I had these extraordinary mystical experiences every time in the fever, because I was no longer identified with my physicality or my ego, and I was traveling in different places. And so in some senses, while physically, you know, it was draining, I looked forward to malaria, because I was having visionary experiences I couldn't otherwise experience. People did it through inflicting pain on themselves. Native American Indian traditions would pierce themselves with arrows. And so there are lots of different ways. People did it with entheogens, what are called hallucinogenics. So there were many, many tried methods of altering the state of consciousness in order to have these encounters with other beings. But it's really important that it be done under the kind of direction of some kind of a spiritual mentor, otherwise it can be really dangerous. And Rudolf Steiner is an extraordinary mentor. Reading his stuff and following his guidance is a surefire way to access those places and to avoid the pitfalls.
I wanted to, I guess, address the fact that although the body changes its cells every few years, if you don't change the kinds of thoughts you think in your mind, you're going to continue to program the cells in your body with the same self-limiting thoughts. So I wanted you to touch on some, you just really covered many of them, but what are some modalities that you found to help liberate the mind and human consciousness from its addiction to its own limitations?
I keep telling you, Hannah, that you're a mystic, a young mystic. You've much more eloquently articulated what I was trying to say. That the image I gave last week of the fact that, we constantly change our cellular makeup, but if it's being driven by a mechanism with an old mindset, we simply corrupt the newly generated cells. And the example I use sometimes is like, if you build a house, a brick house, and there's like 15,000 bricks in your house, and you have a blueprint, and now the house begins to wear, a tree falls in it, you're trying to rebuild it, or a door is leaking or whatever. And you go back to the blueprint to try to replace the damaged part of the house. But in the meantime, you spilled coffee on the blueprint, and the dog has chewed part of it, and the kid, your child has been drawing on it. And now you got a blueprint that you can barely read. And try to recreate the original house with a blueprint, which is, compromised in a way. So you're going to put the window in the wrong place. And so even though you're using the correct components and you're replacing everything that was lost, you're doing it according to a faulty design. But you've articulated it much, much better than I did. That we're programming the new cells with the old thinking. So you're absolutely right. So how do we upgrade our thought processes? And this becomes really, really important. We have to continually push the edges of our cosmologies, because for the vast bulk of us, we're living life driven by unconsciously acquired and unconsciously accessed cosmologies. If I said to you, Hannah, why did you say that? You say, well, seemed like the right thing to say. Or Teresa, why did you do that? Well, it seemed like the appropriate thing to do. It's appropriate only because the vast bulk of us have acquired our cosmologies unconsciously, from education, from parents, from the mass media, whatever. And you put us in any situation and we will unconsciously access that cosmology. We're not even aware we're doing it. And so we're living life being driven by a kind of a model which is totally out of date and which is getting into all kinds of problems. So again and again and again, we have to upgrade our cosmologies. Sometimes even radically prune our cosmologies. And we see this happening in science, even in science itself. When you think about the scientific method per se, whether you're talking about physics or mathematics or geology or psychology, whatever it is, scientific research goes through the following stages. The first stage always is observation in the field, whatever your field of interest is. The second one is you garnish data points. The third thing is you think you're beginning to see some kind of a possible pattern in your data. The fourth one is that you create a hypothesis to try to explain why that pattern might be present. The next one is you set up some kind of an experiment to test your hypothesis. And suppose it proves to be correct. Now that could just be a statistical aberration. So you have to get a few other scientists to replicate your experiment. And if they all come to the same conclusion, now you've got a scientific principle in the field. Slowly by slowly, you put a bunch of principles together and you've created a scientific model of the field. But inevitably, new anomalous data will present themselves, and you have to start tweaking the old model to accommodate the new data. And at some stages, the old model is so totally inadequate, you've got to dispense with it and erect a brand new model that can explain all of the old data and all of the new data. And that happened to us twice in the 20th century with relativity theory, Einstein, and quantum mechanics with Max Planck. And so the same thing has to happen. We have to be scientists of the soul. we have to, on a regular basis, examine our cosmologies and ask the important questions. Can my cosmology explain my life experiences to me and make sense of them and elevate me into a living place? If it's not, it's inadequate. During the 14 years that I spent in Africa, because I lived on the equator in remote areas, you know, and there was no artificial light, you know, it was 12 hours dark, 12 hours daylight. I spent 14 years examining the cosmology of my Irish Catholic upbringing, literally tenet by tenet by tenet, examining it and asking myself, do I really believe that? And if I'd been born Hindu, would I believe that? If I'd been born Buddhist, so I'll take stuff like, you know, that if I eat sausage on a Friday and get killed by a bus crossing the road, I'm going to go to hell for all eternity. Do I really believe that? I don't think so. So let's throw that one out. So one by one, I took these tenets, examined them, and got rid of them, or said, okay, that one works. And then I start building new things into it. So every single one of us, you know, has the responsibility to spend quality time examining our belief systems, our cosmologies, and say, does my cosmology explain my life experiences to me? And does it bring me into a place of love, you know, for all? If it does, great. If it doesn't, tweak it or dismantle it.
Okay. Yeah, that was a very intellectually dense answer. And I would just like to say that the more that I continue to practice spiritual meditation, prayer, mindfulness every day, I become more aware of when I'm in alignment with the divine will and when I'm in alignment with my human will, and start getting, you know, but what I suppose I'm trying to say that it feels like the answer is daily, authentic spiritual practice. And the more that I learn about the history of, you know, how imposed all of these limiting beliefs are on us for generations and generations and generations, and anyone who has any different experiences is shunned or called mad or whatever. And that has been my experience. And luckily I have a family who loves me, even though they haven't had the same experiences. They accept that. And I, you know, the more I learn about the Holy Family, Jesus, Mary Magdalene, and Mother Mary, and how completely advanced they were spiritually. These were not peasants. They were priestesses and states of Christ consciousness, God consciousness, and unity consciousness. And the more that I reconciled that that's the true nature of reality, is we've been programmed to think it's a linear, you get from point A to point B and then you go to heaven. But really the nature of reality is quantum, and you can access that by going within. And I have a lot of anger I'm trying to reconcile because of the Roman Catholic Church and how it hunted the Holy Family and imposed separation consciousness, where, like you said, the gays were not welcome, Jews were not welcome. It imposed separation consciousness, when really the mystical reality is seeing how everything is interconnected. Like the sun is a conscious entity, the water is a conscious entity, praying to the water, like the water is in your blood, the water can program and heal your body. Like it's coming into a state of unity consciousness one day at a time through very, very deliberate, mindful awe and wonder. And when I get very, very frustrated often. I have a lot of fire in me, and that's a beautiful thing, and God made me that way and I love it. But I have to really practice this every day, so I'm not, you know, ruffling the feathers and creating conflict in my life, because I'm constantly bumping up against people who are so addicted to their own self-limitation thinking, because they've been programmed that way since birth. We all have. But there is the Gnostic and the spiritual tradition is there is a divine light within you, and you can liberate that through authentic daily spiritual practice. And that's, I guess, what, you know, I've found.
That is brilliant, Hannah. I'll just leave you with one kind of a little story. And it comes from the Sufi tradition. And you may have heard it already before. This goes back to the 12th to 13th century. And there's a guy who was living on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And every single month he goes across the border with a herd of donkeys and then comes back over again. And the border guards know he's smuggling, but they can never figure out what he's smuggling. And so they look at the backpacks and the donkey, they open the donkey's mouths, they lift the donkey's tails. They can never figure out what the guy is smuggling. And so years and years and years pass by. And finally, one of the guards meets this guy in a marketplace. And the guard says to him, look, I've retired. I'm not on border patrol anymore. It was killing us. We knew you were smuggling. We could never figure out what it was. So off the record completely. Can you tell us what you were smuggling? And the guy said, donkeys.
Donkeys.
You were smuggling donkeys. And so that's my advice to you. Smuggle donkeys in. You don't have to get angry. I know you can get frustrated. Don't get angry. Smuggle donkeys.
You talk about the crucifixion and just the vertical and the horizontal and the intersection. I know you've said it before, but you say that so incredibly, and it just seems so profound to me. And I just wonder if you would just go over that again.
Okay, brilliant. So there is nothing in the life of an avatar like Jesus which is accidental. There is nothing which is not a teaching modality. And so I've said to you many times that, you can interpret something literally, you can interpret symbolically, or you can interpret it mystically. And depending on where people are at, they're going to either have a literal understanding, a kind of a symbolic understanding, or a mystical understanding. So when I look at everything in the life of Jesus, for me, there is nothing accidental. There is nothing which is not a teaching possibility there. And so I've looked at this cross years and years and years ago when I got this realization. I'm looking at the cross, I'm thinking this instrument of torture in which this sinless being was crucified. So I can't think actually of a more vicious way of executing somebody than crucifixion. And it wasn't the Romans who invented it, it was the Persians. The Romans got it from the Persians. But sometimes it would take somebody on the cross 3 days to die. And so there were two versions of it. There was what was called a sedilia, where there was a little seat attached to the cross, so the person could kind of sit while they were there, which meant that it was less painful in the short term, but they spent 3 or 4 days dying in the bleaching sun. Or there would be no sedilia, and so all of the weight went onto the feet. And so now it's excruciating the feet. You try to lift the weight off the feet, and the pressure is on your wrists. And so you have a choice between painful feet or painful hands. And I think about, this extraordinary element of crucifixion. I'm thinking there must be something more to it than that. And then I realize that that's the literal understanding of it. And some people are going to get stuck there. It may give them compassion, or it may give them anger, but it's not going to give them a mystical experience. There must be a deeper truth to that. And I have this vision where it's obvious to me that the vertical arm is pointing to the skies. And Christ is saying, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And the rest of it is planted in Mother Earth. It's embedded in Mother Earth. So here is something that, it combines Father Sky with Mother Earth, or Father God with Mother God. Everything we wear and eat, we get from Mother Earth, and the air we breathe, we get from Father Sky. So this is the connection between earth and heaven, between the transcendence and the immanence of God. And that's where Christ is aligning himself. His body is literally aligned with that reality. And I saw this beautiful poem one time. It said, Jesus, how much do you love us? And Christ says, this much. And so this spread arms represents the fact that he's embracing all creatures. Every living being, is held in the Christ embrace. And then the intersection point, which is exactly where the heart would be, on a real cross. The intersection point is right at the heart. That represents the uniqueness of an individual soul during incarnation. And that's the place in which the two elements of the cross are meant to intersect. But we have to then embrace everything, and we have to realize that we are transcendent beings grounded in an incarnational experience.
Prior to any cosmology, when I was 7, my beloved grandfather died.
Okay.
And I just adored him. He was an amazing man. And after he passed away, I had conversations with him almost every night. And now I grew up in my mother was Southern Baptist and my dad was Methodist Episcopal. And, at 7, we never, the concept of resurrection or, being here multiple times on planet Earth was just not something we discussed when I was 7.
Right.
But I was sure that that he was still with me. And one day I marched down to the family breakfast table and I said, CC, his name was Clifford Clay, and he was known as CC. We didn't call him Grandpa. I said, CC wants everybody to know that he's okay. I talked to him last night, and my family's heads whipped around and looked at me like, I had a horn growing out of the middle of my forehead. And my dad just crumpled because this was his father.
Okay.
And he believed me.
Okay.
And he whisked me away. He said, "Get your clothes on. We're going to your grandmother's." We drove over to my grandmother's house. She lived in a pretty big, imposing house. And we marched up the steps. And he said, "Tell your grandmother what you just told me." And she was a kind lady, but she was also imposing as well. And I told her, and she dismissed it. And my father was so upset that she didn't believe me, but he believed me. And this was not something that, we talked about when I was 6 or whatever. My question to you is, because this occurred prior to any indoctrination of what is or what isn't, prior to, it was just more of a pure experience. Is it easier for children, to use your example, to make the journey from the basement to the lobby? And secondly, are they protected when they travel?
Two brilliant questions and a beautiful storyline, Chris. Thanks a million, Pat. So absolutely, children don't have to come up from the basement to go to have a meal in the lobby. They live in the restaurant. And we send them down into the basement through our educational system, either through the school system or through the church systems. And so children live in the restaurant in which they have Eucharistic encounters all the time, not just with Jesus, but with Grandpa, with Cece in this instance, until they meet the cosmology of parents or schools that send them down into the basement. So when kids are having these kinds of experiences that you had with your grandfather, you're totally protected at that stage. There is no way CC would allow you to be approached by anything even vaguely resembling a disincarnate, discombobulated entity. You're totally protected there. And the problem for us is that when children talk about their imaginary friends, they're imaginary in the sense in which I define imaginary, not fantasy figures. They're really, for them, they can really, really change the wave band between stations, like you do with your television set, with your remote. Kids flip very easily between different stations, looking at different stations. When you're looking at a ball game and you flip channels and you're looking at the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, the ball game hasn't ended. There are other people watching the ball game. So all of these things are happening concurrently. Now the question becomes then, what do we do with our kids when they report these kinds of encounters? So I'm delighted at least that you had a father who was absolutely, enthralled, and supportive of what you had. And so disappointing that neither your mother nor your grandmother could embrace that. And that you were subjected subsequently, like the rest of us, to a school system, which sent you down into the basement. Our kids deserve to live in the lobby, in the restaurant, having Eucharistic encounters with all the great avatars of the past and present.
You referred to yourself at some point in your life having trouble with the Catholic Church excluding so many people and preachers. And other people have mentioned that. And every time we have Mass and we go through the prayers around the Eucharist, and we say that prayer, Lord, I am not worthy. Only this is the way I said it as a child. So, Lord, I am not worthy to receive you. Only say the word. Every time that bothers me.
Absolutely.
And as we go through the other parts of it, where we say, we ask for prayers and thank for the blessings, we say, as I receive you, as we receive you. And it bothers me because I think, what about my husband, who's an atheist, really? And what about all the other people who deserve, who aren't better? I'm not better than them. So why does the prayer exclude them? And isn't the liturgy perpetuating the myth that they are excluded. And what do I do about it when this comes up for me? I know I should just say, and I sort of do. It's not excluding them, but I have a fight with myself every time.
So you're asking two very important questions there, Bonnie. And the first one is this notion of Lord, I am not worthy. If you remember in COJ in the year about 1997, we began to see that there was a discrepancy between the liturgy we were celebrating and the theology I was preaching. And so I wrote a totally different version of the Mass. And I totally took that phrase. You will not find that phrase in the liturgy of our liturgy, Lord, I am not worthy. I excluded those kinds of things completely.
It says something like that.
No, not in the modern, not in our version. There's no sense of unworthiness. So let me just read this for you. When I composed this, here was the introduction. This booklet contains a revision of the Mass, which I have written as a result of a questionnaire, community meetings, and homilies dealing with the topic of bringing our liturgy and our theology into alignment with each other. Doing this, I have tried to combine elegance and tradition and to prune bad theology and bad psychology. I wanted to create a liturgy that celebrates 13 billion years of God's love affair with the entire universe, and not simply a sectarian, anthropocentric ritual that focuses only on human frailty. Though we can all experience the ineffable transcendence of God, we cannot articulate it, but we can use poetry, art, symbol, and metaphor to give expression to God's immanence. We are the Word made flesh. Everything that exists is an incarnation of God. The Eucharistic prayer of the cosmos, which is the core of this liturgy, seeks to portray this in poetic metaphors. So we went out of our way to make sure that all that kind of theology was pruned out. Now, the second part, you're saying when we receive this, we're talking about a group of people gathered for a meal, and we're asking the people gathered for the meal to remember that we're all equally beloved of God. Your husband is eating a meal elsewhere. He's equally beloved. He needs at his own way and his own pace to find out how he's beloved of God. But in the liturgy, we're talking about sharing a meal together as a community. And we're emphasizing that for this community, when we receive this meal, we're elevating ourselves. So the phrase you're alluding to then may be the one that says, may the body and blood of Jesus the Christ bring eternal life to us who receive it. Saying us here, we're a community having a meal together. May every single one of us, participate in this meal, experience the eternal life of Christ consciousness. Your husband, obviously, I don't know your husband. I presume if he's married to you, he's a good man. He's finding sustenance elsewhere. He's got his own kind of community, whether his work community or his friends, I don't know who they are. He's finding Christ consciousness using different words in his own way. So each community will have to find it, and feed each other according to the kind of the words and the rituals that are appropriate for them. But there's nothing exclusionary whatsoever about that phrase or about the liturgy that we celebrate.
My saying that at that moment doesn't exclude the people that are not receiving it in this community then.
Absolutely. This is a community of people just celebrating together. There's other communities celebrating elsewhere. They're using other words and other rituals. Hinduism will have puja. Buddhism will have meditation practices. Every group is feeding itself in its own way. And it's not exclusive in any way. So, okay, here's this community using this kind of ritual to feed itself.
I also had an experience with my granddad when I was 12. He passed away, and he did come back, and we had quite the conversations for about at least 10, 14 years. And then he said he needed to move on. And I asked my brother once, my older brother, where's heaven? And he says, it's where you want it to be.
Totally. That's beautiful, Mary Kate. Yeah. I mean, more and more, when you read the mystical literature, I said many times to you, I don't believe in an afterlife. I believe there is only life in many phases, an incarnational phase, a post-incarnational phase, a reincarnational phase. And so there's not an afterlife. There's just a switch of dimensions. You're changing the channel. And so every single one of us has all of those available to us. So when we shuffle off this mortal coil, what is our experience? And my belief system is that, depending on the frequency, our spiritual frequency, where our soul has been during an incarnation, we want to hang out with people of the same frequency. So if somebody wants to inhabit a heaven of 72 virgins, if that's their version of heaven, they'll create that. If somebody wants to create, an afterlife in which they're, the best golfer in the world, they can create that, because you're creating it out of a different level of the self. In physicality, there's a huge time gap between the thought and the manifestation of the thought. In your dreams at night, there is no difference. Everything you think of in your dream manifests immediately. So in the afterlife, there are totally different stages. Now, when you look, for instance, at a rainbow, and you think, there are 7 colors in the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. There are millions of colors in a rainbow. These are just categories, but there's transitions between all these colors into each other. There are millions, and there are millions of different versions of the, post-death scenario. People will recreate the heaven that they believe in, and they'll hang out with people who believe the same version of heaven that they do. And if people are stuck with a kind of a physical notion that there's going to be great food and great whiskey, they'll create that, and that's fine. But at some stage, they'll outgrow that and realize there must be something better than just good food and great whiskey. And so they move to the next level. And so finally, we keep moving, and we keep finding ourselves in the company of souls who've reached a particular frequency in their understanding of reality. And they will create that next version of heaven. But there's no end to the versions of heaven until we merge completely with God. And so, every version of heaven simply is one that we've created through the consensus of people operating from the same spiritual frequency.
So I had a couple of sort of quick questions, I think. One is, if you're doing a sort of an assisted past life regression, what level of body are you accessing? It's not a dream exactly, because you're not technically asleep. So I'm just kind of wondering if, so that's one. And the other one has to do with these particles. I think you call them particles. A pops up here, doesn't travel, but pops up there. I'm wondering how that's related to living parallel lives.
Each of those questions could be a retreat. So let me try and deal with them really, really quickly. The first one is, when you do past life regression, which level of body you're accessing. If you're in the hands of a really good practitioner, or aggressive hypnotherapist of various kinds, what they will try to access is what's called the Akashic Records. And the Akashic Records are the archives of all of the experiences of all souls throughout all incarnations, in all dimensions and in all planets. It's the Hall of Records. It is where Grandmother God, stores all of the videotapes she's taken of all her children ever. And so, there's a volume, devoted to Cardin Rubin, the person, the soul, who's incarnated as Cardin Rubin this time. So a good hypnotherapist will allow you to access to that particular volume that's dealing, with your own past incarnations. So very, very briefly, you're accessing a Hall of Records. Yeah. So the second one, the story of the electrons. In quantum mechanical theory, when you try to collapse a wave function down to a specific particle outcome, it's the observing consciousness that does that. And what they discover is that, electrons don't move continually. They appear and disappear. And I've used this example before. If you were to string Christmas lights along the ridge of the roof of your house, and I'm going to update the image a little bit. I was thinking about this during the week. So you got a string of lights coming up. Imagine there's a chimney right in the middle, and then the lights continue at the other side. And you put it on, and from a distance, it just looks like there's a single light that's running along the roof. It gets to the chimney, and it runs right through the chimney, and then continues on the other side. What's happening, of course, is the light is not moving. The first bulb is coming on for an instant and then going off. The second bulb is coming on almost immediately and going off. The third bulb is coming on. So from the distance, it looks like there's a single light traveling on the roof. There isn't. There's a whole bunch of light bulbs coming on and coming off in such quick succession that we can't process it quickly enough. The human eye can only see, if you move anything faster than 1/23 of a second, the human eye cannot distinguish between it. So if it happens faster than 1/23 of a second, it looks like a continuous stream of light going across the roof and through the chimney. Now that's what's happening at quantum mechanics. That electrons that appear in A and then appear in B do not occupy any space in between A and B. They appear, they demanifest, and then they appear in a different location. So, but they're not moving in between them, and that's called the quantum leap. Yeah, and if I build a chimney into that, that's called quantum tunneling. That it seems to go through solid objects. But at the quantum mechanical level, it's the observing consciousness, and light won't make up its mind whether to appear as a wave or a particle until it's observed.
Mhm.
It's measured but not observed. It still does not make up its mind. There's some extraordinary research that shows if you conduct a double state experiment, but you don't observe the outcome, the light, the photon hasn't made up its mind whether to appear in a scatter plot, or in discrete particles until it's observed. And it's the observing that forces it to collapse to a particular outcome. So it's our observing consciousness, that selects out. So you mentioned parallel universes. So when scientists try to explain this, there are two different explanations. There are many different explanations. There's kind of the Niels Bohr explanation called the Copenhagen interpretation. So there are lots of different interpretations. There's another one, which is the multiple worlds explanation, that every time an electron is faced with a choice between A and B, it chooses A and B. Or in macro cosmic terminology, whenever you have a choice between A and B in your life, you spin off a parallel universe in which you choose A and a different one and you choose B. So you can accommodate this extraordinary phenomenon by a theory of multiple universes to accommodate all the possible combinations, or by the fact that you're dealing with manifestation, demanifestation, remanifestation, depending on the observing consciousness. Ask Josh about this.
I have talked to Josh about this.
Oh, okay.
And he talks about that very tiny moment when they're writing down their calculations, and when it clicks, and that's where it came up. He says it's because we don't yet know what consciousness is, right? Because the consciousness is interacting.
And the reason
until that moment, they try to get to that little tiny bit of time
and
to grab it, and they can't grab it.
They can't, because the founder of quantum mechanics was Max Planck. And so it's called after, there's a Planck length and a Planck time. A Planck length is 1.616255 by 10 to the power of minus 35 meters. It's unimaginably small. Right. And a Planck length of time is the amount of time it takes a photon of light traveling in a vacuum to transverse a Planck length. So there is no such thing as continuous flow of time. Right. There are discrete moments of time separated by such tiny intervals that we can't detect them, even with our instrumentation. And right. There's no such thing as a smooth surface. There are discrete chunks joined together by tiny gaps, which are so small, 1.616255 by 10 to the power minus 35 meters, that you can't see them. And the same thing is happening on your computer screen right now. As you're watching your computer stream, it's composed of tens of thousands of pixels. But the screen is refreshing itself. So when you think something is moving across, you think my hand is moving across the screen as you watch it. My hand is not moving across the screen. What's happening is it's taking a snapshot of my hand. It's refreshing the screen. My hand is in a different position. It's taking a photograph of that. It refreshes itself again. My hand is in a different position. So it appears continuous because it's happening at Planck time, which is 10 to the power of minus 43 seconds. So it looks like a continuous movement over continuous time, but neither time nor space are actually continuous.
You talked about cosmology, and which sounds very much like we're pretty much hardwired in this cosmology. And what I've noticed in my own life and many other people is part of that cosmology is self-destructive. And I've spent the last 40 years trying to break through that and have had no success at all. And no matter how much self-reflection, no matter how many words of wisdom, no matter how many workshops and this and that, I've been unable to break through it. And I've seen this with so many other people that they really are struggling to get into a higher space, but they can't get there. And no matter what they do, they're stuck. And I'm thinking, you talked about entities, lost entities on the astral plane. Maybe some of us are infected by some evil spirits trying to sabotage us. I don't know. But I know that so many of us are stuck and we cannot get through that barrier into a higher plane and move on. So any thoughts you have on that, I'd appreciate.
Yeah, it's a very important understanding, Chris, and my heart goes out to you, my brother. I devoted an entire retreat just last month to the whole notion of the problem of evil and what the different kind of facets and elements, of the evil we experience in our world in our times could be attributed. So that's that's like a 9-hour long kind of a dissertation on this topic. But for the fact that you've been experiencing for 40 years an inability to break through, my heart goes out to you, Chris. What I would say to you is, your entire incarnation this time, I'm not here to judge. Maybe it is to wrestle with this on behalf of the rest of us and show us somebody who has the courage and the resilience to keep going in spite of the extraordinary, relentless pressure that you're under. Maybe you're here to teach the rest of us, this kind of patience, this kind of resilience. And to add to that, the fact that this lifetime, even if you live to be 100 years old, Chris, it's a blink of an eye in your incarnational journey. And it may well be that you made a vow to accept an extraordinarily difficult mission in this incarnation in order to teach the rest of us something else, whether it's patience or compassion or whatever. But I guarantee you, you have a mission. And from my knowledge of you over the years, you fulfill that mission in an extraordinary way. You keep working at it. You've never given up as long as I've known you. And for me, you're a model of somebody who's resilient to the power of N. So big hug to you, my brother.
Well, I'm always enchanted by synchronicities. And this April, with this Easter season and spring, I had so many because you do this amazing exploration of resurrection. And then Andrew Harvey, I shared that course with the group about, he's a lit up mystic. You can really feel that illumination, that energy that he transmits when he talks about spiritual matters. So his whole course was the birth of a new world through Christ consciousness. So, he got initiated by that monk, Father Bede, who lives in the desert, and he totally is, in this higher spiritual state of being. And so he said that, Andrew said that the last class was on resurrection and transfiguration. He said that Jesus' mystical language was not of language, it was of the body itself, and that we have to access the kingdom of God within through the sacred heart, which is the stargate to all higher dimensions. And so we have to honor that within us. That's the biggest lesson of life on planet Earth. And you do it by loving. And if you can't love, you forgive. You have to stay in these states of, can I love? Can I love myself? Can I love others? Can I love the planet? Or can I forgive that moment of resistance, not being able to love and honor all this life force? So he just says, yes, you have to raise your vibration and your frequency. And then your cells, and he talked about the rainbow body. When you raise your vibration, your cells are like shifting and expanding and amplifying in this particle field. And then you'll get that glimpse and knowing that the rainbow body, which we're just connected to all of life and of all of its potentialities all the time.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful, Ingrid. You're absolutely right. And so all of these are interconnected. They're just different channels on the same TV station. And as I keep saying to you, as you move from channel to channel, the channel you've just left hasn't disappeared. It's disappeared off your screen. There are other people watching that channel, so they continue to exist. So all of these levels coexist. The trick seems to be somehow that we can access, because anybody at let's say there's 7 levels to the system. There's a lot more than that. Anybody who's at level 7 has access to all of the other previous ones. Somebody who's at level 5 has access to the previous ones, but not to level 6 or level 7. Somebody who's at level 3 has access to 3, 2, and 1, but not 4, 5, 6, and 7. So we only have access to those levels that we have encountered, and incorporated into ourselves. And thereafter, we can move between the channels in any fashion we want. But we're limited. We cannot live at a place we haven't previously experienced. And we can only experience it, by these extraordinary spiritual practices. And as far as the heart is concerned, is absolutely right that, on the cross, the intersection point is right where the heart is. And the heart is the organ of incorporation of all of the levels that we've experienced. So we do that through practices. And so we have to figure out what are some of the practices. I gave you 5 simple practices a few weeks ago that I have written on the mirror in my bathroom. So every time I go in there, I remind myself. And that is, I must replace fear with love in my life. I must replace anxiety with trust in my life. I must replace anger with compassion in my life. I must replace judgment, with wisdom in my life, and I must replace, vengeance with forgiveness in my life. So for me, they're like the 5 mantras, that I've created for 2021, that I keep reminding myself, this is how you need to operate during the day.
I'm very interested in how you have experienced providence in your life, like the other way around, like how God comes down to meet us. Yes.
So here's the thing again. It is not where we look that's important. It's how we look. When we don't know how to look, we can look everywhere and find nothing. When we figure out how to look, it doesn't matter where we look, we'll find everything. And so when Jesus says, for instance, a simple teaching like, look at the lilies of the field. They don't spin or weave or gather into barns. And yet I tell you, not a single one, Solomon in all his finery was never dressed as beautifully as one of these. So what is Christ saying? You can look everywhere. And if you know how to look, there's providence right there. So it's not like providence are these extraordinary thunderbolts from on high that shake you up. They happen occasionally. There are the Paul on the road to Damascus that happened. Or maybe for me getting thrown out of Kenya, something like that. So there are occasions like that. But for the main part, if you really know how to look, there is no place you can look where providence is not giving you a clue as to how to proceed. So it's a question of just changing the way you look rather than changing the place you're looking. Namaste, Pet.